Close your eyes and let me take you somewhere you've never been before, somewhere you couldn't go, even if you wanted to. We're travelling back, not years or decades or even centuries. We're going back 300 million years, long before the dinosaurs ruled the earth, before the first flower ever bloomed in a meadow, before even trees learned to reach toward the sky. There was a world ruled by shadows. This was the Permian period, a time when the earth itself was experimenting. The air had different oxygen levels, sometimes too much, sometimes too little. The seas were shallow and warm, stretching across continents like vast primordial baths. There were no mammals scurrying through undergrowth, no birds singing in the dawn, no flowers attracting bees. The world was quieter then, stranger, like a half-remembered dream, and lurking in the muck of these ancient seas, hidden in the sediment and shadows. Something impossible was about to be born. But here's what will keep you awake at night, even as I try to tell you a story to help you sleep. This creature, this thing that was born in those ancient waters, it shouldn't have existed, not according to everything we thought we knew about life, about evolution, about the rules that govern what's possible and what isn't. And yet, it did exist. For millions of years it thrived in those murky seas, until one day it vanished completely, leaving behind only the faintest trace of its impossible existence. A trace that would wait 300 million years for someone to find it. Are you ready to meet the monster that broke all the rules? The creature that made scientists question everything they thought they knew. Then settle in, get comfy, and let me tell you about the Tullimonster. First, let me tell you about Francis Tully. He wasn't a famous scientist. He wasn't a professor at a prestigious university. He was just a man who loved rocks, a collector, someone who spent his weekends digging through the fossil beds near his home in Illinois, searching for treasures that time had left behind. Francis had patient hands and curious eyes, the kind of person who could spend hours carefully chiseling away at dark shale, never knowing what secrets might be hiding just beneath the surface. The Mazon Creek fossil beds were like a library of ancient life. For millions of years, creatures had died and been buried in the soft mud of an ancient river delta. The mud had hardened into shale, preserving these ancient beings like flowers pressed between the pages of a book. Francis had found wonderful things there before: ancient ferns, primitive sharks, insects with wings like stained glass windows. But on this particular day, and oh, how different the world might be if this day had never come, Francis found something else entirely. Francis stared at the fossil in his hands. He turned it this way and that, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. It looked like nothing at all. Like someone had taken parts from different animals and assembled them according to rules that didn't exist. It was roughly 8 inches long, with a body that seemed almost balloon-like. From the front extended what could only be described as a trunk, but not like an elephant's trunk. This one ended in a curious appendage, lined with what appeared to be tiny teeth, like a grasping claw designed by an alien intelligence. And the eyes were perhaps the strangest part of all. They sat at the ends of stalks that protruded from the creature's head, like the eyes of a snail, but larger, more prominent, more aware somehow, even in death. Francis knew he had found something special, something different, but even he, with his collector's instincts and his lifetime of fossil hunting, couldn't have imagined just how different this creature truly was. He carefully wrapped the fossil and took it home. Then he did what any responsible fossil hunter would do. He took it to the experts, to the scientists who were supposed to understand these things, to the people who could tell him what he had found. But what happens next was nothing he could have ever predicted. The experts looked at Francis's fossil. They examined it under microscopes. They compared it to every known creature in their vast libraries of knowledge. They held conferences. They wrote papers. They argued. And after all of that, they had no idea what it was. It was as if evolution had drawn a creature from a dream, or perhaps from a nightmare. Something that followed rules that hadn't been written yet. Something that belonged to a chapter of life's story that had been torn out and lost. They named it Tullimonstrum gregarium, the Tully monster. The gregarium part meant it was commonly found. Francis's discovery had opened the floodgates, and soon collectors were finding Tully monsters throughout the Maison Creek beds. But the monster part, that was more honest than they might have intended, because this creature was monstrous in the truest sense of the word. It was anomalous, inexplicable, a living contradiction that challenged everything they thought they knew about how life works. And so began one of paleontology's greatest mysteries, a puzzle that would frustrate and fascinate scientists for decades to come. But before we dive deeper into this mystery, let me ask you something. Have you ever found something that didn't make sense? Something that seemed to break the rules of something you thought you understood so deeply? Well, multiply that feeling by 1,000, and you might begin to understand how those scientists felt when they first laid eyes on Francis Tully's impossible monster. The question that would haunt them for decades was simple to ask, but seemingly impossible to answer. What exactly was this thing? Now picture this. You're a scientist. You've spent your entire career studying life, how it evolves, how it adapts, how different creatures are related to each other. You understand the family tree of life. You know where everything belongs. And then someone brings you the Tully monster. Suddenly all your expertise feels useless. All those years of study seem inadequate, because this creature, this impossible creature, doesn't fit anywhere. The scientists tried everything. They approached it from every angle they could think of. Maybe it's a worm, some said. The elongated body certainly looked worm-like. But worms don't have complex eyes on stalks. Worms don't have grasping appendages with teeth. Perhaps it's a mollusk, others suggested, like a squid or a snail that lost its shell. And there were similarities. The flexible body, the grasping appendage that could be like a tentacle. But mollusks have very different internal structures. Their organs are arranged differently. The Tully monster's anatomy didn't match. What about a primitive fish? This theory gained some traction. The creature lived in water after all. It had what might be a notochord, a primitive backbone, but fish have fins. Fish have gills in predictable places. The Tully monster had neither. This kept the scientists awake at night, staring at the ceiling, trying to solve this puzzle. The Tully monster seemed to have characteristics from all over the evolutionary tree. It had vertebrate-like features mixed with invertebrate characteristics. It had primitive traits alongside more advanced ones. It was like finding a bird with gills and fur, or a fish with feathers and a mammalian heart. According to everything they understood about evolution, this shouldn't happen. Evolution is supposed to be a branching tree, where creatures gradually develop new traits as they split into different lineages. You don't get to pick and choose features from completely different branches of the tree and mix them together like ingredients in a recipe. Eugene Richardson, one of the paleontologists who spent decades studying the creature, once said something that perfectly captured the frustration. You could fit it into any box you wanted, and none of them would feel right. Think about that for a moment. Imagine trying to categorize something that resists all categories. It's like trying to decide whether the colour purple is more red or more blue, when perhaps it's something else entirely. Something for which we don't have words. The Tully monster was nature's riddle, a biological joke with no punchline, a creature that seemed to exist purely to confound anyone who tried to understand it. Years passed. Decades. New Tully monster fossils were discovered. Hundreds of them. thousands. Each one revealed new details but deepened the mystery rather than solving it. Some specimens showed what appeared to be a notochord, that primitive backbone-like structure that's found in early vertebrates. Others showed a segmented structure more typical of invertebrates. Some had clearer views of the internal organs, which only raised more questions about how this creature could have possibly functioned. Scientists published papers with titles like The Enigma of Tullimonstrum and A Problematic Fossil from the Pennsylvanian. The creature had become paleontology's most famous unsolved mystery. But perhaps the most unsettling thing about the Tully monster wasn't what it was, but what it represented. If this creature could exist, if evolution could produce something so completely outside the rules, then what else might be possible? What other impossible creatures might have lived and died without leaving any trace? The Tully monster had become more than just a paleontological puzzle. It had become a philosophical problem, a reminder that the natural world doesn't always follow the neat categories and logical progressions that human minds crave. And just when it seemed like the mystery might never be solved, when scientists were beginning to accept that some questions might not have answers, someone discovered something remarkable hidden in the monster's ancient eyes, something that would change everything. Or would it? But that discovery, that breakthrough that seemed to solve everything, would only lead to an even deeper mystery, one that challenges not just what we know about the Tully monster, but what we think we know about life itself. Are you ready to peer into the eyes of a creature that died 300 million years ago? 66 years. That's how long the Tully monster kept its secrets. 66 years of confusion, debate and scientific head-scratching. Entire careers were built on studying this creature. Entire reputations were made and lost on theories about what it might be. But in 2016, a team of researchers decided to try something different. Instead of looking at the creature's overall shape or its strange anatomy, they decided to look deeper, much deeper. They wanted to examine the Tully monster at the molecular level, and they started with the eyes. Victoria McCoy and her team at Yale University took microscopic samples from the Tully monster's eye stalks. Using powerful electron microscopes and sophisticated chemical analysis, they began to search for something called melanosomes. Now, melanosomes might sound like scientific jargon, but they're actually quite simple to understand. They're tiny structures inside cells that contain pigment, the biological equivalent of paint containers. They're what give colour to eyes, skin, hair, feathers and scales. But, more importantly, different groups of animals have different types of melanosomes. The shape, size and structure of these microscopic containers can tell you what kind of creature you're looking at. They're like biological fingerprints, unique to different branches of the evolutionary tree. As Dr. McCoy peered through her microscope, examining the Tully monster's ancient eyes, she began to see something extraordinary. There, preserved in stone for 300 million years, were melanosomes. But not just any melanosomes. These structures were elongated, rod-like, with a very specific internal organisation. They looked exactly like the melanosomes found in the eyes of vertebrates, animals with backbones. More specifically, they looked like the melanosomes found in a very particular group of primitive vertebrates, lampreys. Perhaps you've seen them, those eel-like creatures that attach themselves to other fish with their circular tooth-filled mouths. They're primitive vertebrates, some of the most ancient creatures with backbones still alive today, living fossils in a sense. Could it be that the Tully monster was related to these ancient vertebrates? Could this strange, impossible creature actually be a very early, very weird vertebrate itself? The team was excited. After decades of uncertainty, they finally had a clue. A genuine molecular-level piece of evidence that seemed to place the Tully monster somewhere on the vertebrate family tree. Headlines around the world proclaimed that the Tullimonster mystery had finally been solved. It was a vertebrate, a strange, early vertebrate, but a vertebrate nonetheless. The creature that had confused scientists for 66 years had finally found its place in the tree of life. But you know what they say about things that seem too good to be true? Because even with this breakthrough, even with this molecular evidence, the Tullimonster refused to make complete sense. Yes, it might be a vertebrate. The melanosomes suggested as much. But everything else about the creature was still deeply, profoundly weird. Vertebrates, you see, have certain characteristics. They have bilateral symmetry. Their left and right sides mirror each other. They have specific arrangements of organs. Their nervous systems follow predictable patterns. The Tullimonster, well, it seemed to follow some of these rules and ignore others completely. Its eyes were on stalks, something no known vertebrate has ever had. Its grasping appendage with teeth was unlike anything in the vertebrate playbook. Its body proportions were all wrong. It was like finding a bird that laid eggs underwater and breathed through its feathers. You could call it a vertebrate, but you'd have to admit it was the strangest vertebrate that ever lived. So strange that it seemed to stretch the very definition of what a vertebrate could be. And this raised an uncomfortable question. If the Tullimonster was indeed a vertebrate, what did that say about the flexibility of evolution? How weird could life get while still following the basic patterns we thought we understood? Dr. McCoy and her team had solved one mystery, but in doing so, they had created another. They had answered the question, what is it? But had raised an even more troubling question. How is it possible? The melanosomes in the Tullimonster's eyes were like a message from the past, a whisper from an ancient world where the rules of life were still being written. They told us that this creature was part of our family tree, however distantly. But they also told us that our family tree was stranger and more wonderful than we had ever imagined. It was like meeting a relative you never knew existed. One who spoke your language but followed customs that made no sense, familiar and alien at the same time. But scientists were still just as baffled after this discovery. If the Tullimonster could exist, if evolution could produce something so thoroughly bizarre while still remaining within the bounds of possibility, then what other impossible creatures might have lived and died without our ever knowing? The Tullimonster wasn't just a scientific curiosity anymore. It had become a window into a deeper truth about life itself, a truth that was both beautiful and terrifying in its implications. Evolution, it seemed, was far more creative and far more unpredictable than anyone had dared to imagine. And so our story brings us to this. If nature could create the Tullimonster once, what else might it create? What other rules might it be willing to break? What other impossible creatures might be waiting to be discovered? Let me tell you something that might change how you sleep tonight. Something that might make you look at every creature you encounter, every bird, every insect, every fish, with new eyes. The Tullimonster forces us to confront a possibility that most people never consider. That evolution isn't the neat, orderly process we like to imagine. That the rules we think govern life might be more like suggestions. We like our evolution tidy. We like to think of it as a tree with clear branches, each leading to specific types of creatures. Fish branch off here, mammals there, birds over there. Everything in its proper place, following logical rules, building on previous innovations in predictable ways. But the Tullimonster suggests something far more disturbing, that evolution is less like a well-organised tree and more like, well, like an artist who's had too much coffee and access to unlimited supplies. Sometimes the results are masterpieces, sometimes they're beautiful disasters, and sometimes there's something that shouldn't work at all, but somehow does. Think about it this way. Even today, even in our modern, well-understood world, Nature produces creatures that seem impossible. The platypus lays eggs like a reptile, produces milk like a mammal, and has a bill like a duck. If we only knew it from fossils, we might think it was as impossible as the Tullimonster. The anglerfish carries its own flashlight and can unhinge its jaw to swallow prey larger than itself. The octopus has 3 hearts, blue blood, and can change not just its colour but its texture to match its surroundings. The praying mantis can turn its head 180 degrees and sometimes eats its mate's head during reproduction. Any of these creatures, if discovered as fossils with no modern context, might seem as bizarre and impossible as our ancient monster. The Tullimonster teaches us something that goes beyond just biological curiosity. It shows us that evolution is willing to experiment in ways we never imagined. It's willing to try combinations that seem impossible. It's willing to break its own rules. And if that was true 300 million years ago, during one relatively brief period in Earth's history, what else might have been tried? What other experiments in living might have existed for a while, thrived, and then vanished completely? The fossil record, for all its wonders, is like a book with most of its pages missing. We see chapter titles here and there, a few complete paragraphs, occasional sentences, but most of the story is gone, lost to time and the random chance of preservation. For every Tullimonster that got fossilized, how many other impossible creatures lived and died without leaving any trace? How many other biological experiments were tried and abandoned? How many other ways of being alive existed that we'll never know about? This is perhaps the most profound implication of the Tullimonster's existence. It suggests that life is far more creative, far more experimental, far more willing to try the impossible than we ever realized. Consider this. The Tullimonster lived for millions of years. It wasn't a failed experiment that died out quickly. It was successful in its own strange way. It found a way to make its impossible anatomy work. It found food, it reproduced, it survived in its ancient seas for eons. This means that nature doesn't just tolerate the bizarre, sometimes it rewards it. If evolution was willing to create the Tullimonster in the past, what might it create in the future? What impossible creatures might emerge in the next 100 million years? What new ways of being alive might evolve that would seem as bizarre to us as the Tullimonster seemed to its discoverers? And here's an even stranger thought. What if evolution is still conducting these impossible experiments? What if somewhere in the deep ocean or in some remote ecosystem we haven't fully explored, there are creatures living right now that would seem as impossible as the Tullimonster? Creatures that follow rules we haven't discovered yet, that combine traits we think shouldn't go together. The Tullimonster died out millions of years before the first dinosaur walked the earth. Its kind never returned. Its particular way of being alive was tried once, succeeded for a while, and then became extinct, leaving behind only stone memories. But its legacy lives on in every impossible creature we discover, in every biological rule we find broken, in every reminder that life is stranger and more wonderful than we can imagine. And so, we come to the end of our journey through deep time, back to those ancient seas where the Tullimonster once swam, where it hunted with its impossible anatomy, where it lived its strange life according to rules we're still trying to understand. But before you close your eyes and drift off to sleep, let me leave you with one final thought. We like to think we understand life. We like to believe that every creature has a place, every anatomy makes sense, every evolutionary story follows a logical path from simple to complex, from primitive to advanced. We create categories and kingdoms, families and phyla. We draw neat diagrams and write orderly textbooks. We convince ourselves that nature follows our logic, that biology respects our rules. But Tullimonstrum gregarium, the Tullimonster, reminds us of something we often forget. Nature doesn't follow our logic. Life doesn't respect our categories. Evolution doesn't read our textbooks. Nature does what it wants. It experiments with impossible combinations. It tries things that shouldn't work. It creates creatures that don't fit our definitions of what's possible. And sometimes, just sometimes, it lets these impossible creatures live and thrive, just to remind us that our understanding of life is still incomplete, still growing, still filled with wonders we haven't discovered yet. The most unsettling truth about the Tully monster isn't that it existed 300 million years ago. It's that it reminds us how much we still don't know, how many other impossible creatures might have lived and died without our knowledge, how many rules of biology we haven't discovered yet, how many ways of being alive we haven't imagined. It reminds us that we ourselves are part of this ongoing experiment, that human beings, for all our intelligence and technology, are just another strange creature that evolution decided to try, another impossible combination of traits that somehow works. And just as the Tully monster eventually went extinct, leaving behind only fossilized memories of its impossible existence, so too will humanity someday pass from the earth. Our cities will crumble, our books will decay, our stories will be forgotten. But perhaps, millions of years in the future, some curious intelligence will discover our fossils. They'll find our strange bones, our oversized skulls, evidence of our peculiar upright posture, and our inexplicably complex brains. And perhaps they'll be just as confused by us as we are by the Tully monster. Perhaps they'll wonder how such a bizarre creature could have existed. Perhaps they'll debate whether we were vertebrates or something else entirely. Perhaps they'll write scientific papers with titles like The Enigma of Homo sapiens and A Problematic Fossil from the Anthropocene.